The morning Mamie Talbot buried her husband, the sky over Caldwell County, Kansas, was the color of a bruise, purple and ugly at the edges. And she told herself she would not cry again after that day. And she never did, not once. Not even when the bank man came 3 weeks later with his hat in his hands and news that made the bruise in the sky look gentle by comparison. That was the spring of 1878, and Mamie was 31 years old, and she had 5 acres of rocky Kansas soil, one gray mule named Absalom who hated everyone including Mamie herself, a farmhouse with a door that did not close all the way on cold nights, 2 milk-glass kerosene lamps, a cast-iron stove that burned hot on one side and cold on the other, a cellar with 6 jars of pickled beets, and absolutely nothing else to her name except the name itself, which had been her mother's before her and which she wore like armor. Her husband, Gerald Talbot, had not been a bad man. He had been a weak man, which was a different thing, and Mamie had understood the distinction for a long time before she admitted it even to herself. Gerald had borrowed against the land, their land, the land his father had broken his back for, the land Mamie had poured 7 years of her own labor into, borrowed against it from a man named Cyrus Fitch, who ran the only lending operation in Harlow Creek, which was the small and often sorry town 3 miles east of the farm. Gerald had borrowed the money to buy cattle, and the cattle had died of a respiratory sickness the first winter, and Gerald had spent 2 years trying to pay back what he owed, and then Gerald himself had died of a fever in March of 1878, and Mamie had stood in the yard on the afternoon after the funeral and looked at the 5 acres and the mule and the house, and understood with perfect clarity that she was now entirely and completely alone. She was not a woman who asked for help. She had grown up in a household where asking for help was treated as a kind of moral failing, and even if that philosophy had made her harder than she might have liked to be, it had also made her capable in ways that most women of her acquaintance were not. She could repair a fence line. She could plow a row as straight as any man. She could haggle at the feed store and drive a nail and read a contract, which was more than Gerald had been able to say, and the thought of that made her feel guilty and then angry at the guilt, because she was not going to spend the rest of her life apologizing to a dead man for understanding things better than he had. By April she had planted what she could afford to plant, which was not much. She had used the last of Gerald's savings, which amounted to $11.40, to buy seed corn and a small measure of wheat seed, and she had plowed the 5 acres herself behind Absalom, who had tried to bite her 3 times in the first hour, and then settled into his usual posture of aggrieved cooperation. She watered. She weeded. She watched the sky with the particular intensity of someone who has everything riding on whether or not it rains. Harlow Creek in 1878 was a town of about 400 people, which made it larger than some and smaller than most in that part of Kansas. It had a general store run by a man named Denton Farley who chewed tobacco constantly and was otherwise perfectly pleasant. It had a hotel that also served as a saloon on Friday and Saturday nights. It had a church with a bell that worked on Sundays and a schoolhouse that worked Monday through Friday, and it had a livery stable and a blacksmith and a post office and a sheriff named Amos Prout who was getting old and knew it. It was at Denton Farley's general store in the second week of April that Mamie first saw Noah Brooks. She was not looking for him, and she would not have noticed him at all except that Absalom chose that particular morning to get loose from the hitching post out front and trot directly into the store through the open door, which was something a mule had almost certainly never done before in the history of Denton Farley's establishment. Mamie came in behind Absalom at a dead run, shouting at him in a voice that did not particularly care who heard her, and she grabbed his halter and hauled back and was met with the full weight of a 140-pound mule who had decided he was not leaving until he investigated the barrel of dried corn that sat near the back wall. The man who stepped in from the side and got a shoulder behind Absalom's neck, angling him away from the corn barrel without dramatics, and without making any noise at all about it, was tall in a way that did not call attention to itself. The way tall things in nature are simply tall without apology. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and hands that were so clearly accustomed to work that the work had changed their shape. He wore a plain canvas coat and a hat that had been good once and was serviceable now, and he smelled like horses and wood smoke in the outdoors, and he got Absalom turned around and out the door in about 45 seconds without once looking like he was performing a favor. Outside, with Absalom secured to the post more firmly this time, the man straightened up and looked at Mamie and did not say anything. He had gray eyes that were calm in a way that did not feel like indifference. He was perhaps 35, perhaps a year or two less, with the kind of face that had taken weather and kept its character. Mamie said thank you in a tone that implied the gratitude was genuine but the vulnerability was not up for discussion. He said, "That mule has opinions." "He has opinions about everything," Mamie said, "mostly negative ones." A small silence. He touched the brim of his hat. "Noah Brooks," he said. "I'm working at the Hennessy Ranch northeast of town." "Mamie Talbot," she said. "I'm not working at anyone's ranch." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile but the territory adjacent to one. "I know who you are," he said. "I'm sorry about your husband." She looked at him steadily. "Thank you," she said again, and this time there was nothing else attached to it. He did not press, and she respected that. He stepped aside to let her go back into the store, and she went, and she bought the things she had come for: a tin of baking powder, a spool of thread, a box of matches, and when she came out he was gone and Absalom was still there, glaring at a sparrow on the fence post across the street as though he had been personally offended by its existence. She did not think much about Noah Brooks for the next several days because she did not have time to think about anything except the work, which was relentless and immediate and required everything she had. The Hennessy Ranch was one of the larger spreads in Caldwell County, run by a man named Patrick Hennessy, who was fair to his hired men by the standards of the time, which meant he paid them in actual money at actual intervals and did not work them on Sundays unless there was an emergency. Noah Brooks had come to the Hennessy place in February of that year, arriving from somewhere to the south. He did not talk much about where, and proving himself useful in the way that men who have worked cattle all their lives prove themselves useful, quickly, quietly, without needing to be told the same thing twice. He had noticed the Talbot farm on one of his first rides out toward the western pasture. He noticed it because it was small and clearly being worked by someone with more determination than resources, the fence lines patched in a half-dozen different ways, the field freshly turned, but the turning visible in a way that spoke of a single person and a single mule doing the work that should have required twice the labor. He had heard about Gerald Talbot's death from the other men at the ranch. He had filed it away in the quiet way he filed most things. The morning after he met Mamie at the general store, Noah Brooks rode past the Talbot farm on his way to the eastern boundary of the Hennessy Range and saw her in the field at dawn, already working, her back straight and her hands on the plow handles, and Absalom in front of her being his usual uncooperative self. The light was coming up pink and gold over the eastern hills, and it fell on her in a way that stopped his breath just slightly, and he rode on without stopping because stopping would have been presumptuous, and because she had not asked for anything. But he noticed something else as he rode past. The sacks of corn seed stacked near her gate were nearly empty. He knew the look of nearly empty seed sacks. He had grown up poor in ways that he did not discuss, and so he recognized poverty without announcing it. He did not make a decision about it right away. He simply let the thought sit the way he let most thoughts sit, turning them over in his mind on slow rides and during quiet evenings in the bunkhouse, while the other men played cards and told stories he had heard before. At the end of his second week at the Hennessy Ranch, on the day he rode into Harlow Creek to collect the mail for Patrick Hennessy, he bought an extra sack of seed grain at Denton Farley's store, a good mix, milo and sorghum with some winter wheat threaded in, the kind of thing that would do well in that particular soil if the season was fair. He paid for it with his own wages. He did not tell anyone at the ranch about it. That evening, riding back past the Talbot farm in the long gold light of late afternoon, he set the sack down on the flat stone beside her gate. He did not knock. He did not call out. He rode on. Mamie found it the next morning. She stood over it for a long time, looking at it, and her first feeling was irritation because she did not know what it meant or who had left it, and she did not like ambiguity. Her second feeling, which she pushed down hard, was relief, because the grain she had was not going to cover the whole 5 acres, and she had known it for a week, and had not let herself dwell on it because dwelling on things you cannot change is not useful. Her third feeling, which she examined the most carefully, was something she could not name yet, and she was not going to name it, and she was going to plant the grain and be grateful and leave it at that. She planted it. The milo went in along the south fence where the soil was deepest, and the sorghum went in the middle section where the water tended to pool a little after heavy rain, and the wheat she worked in along the north edge. Absalom cooperated better than usual that day, which she took as a sign of something, though she was not sure of what. The next week there was another sack at the gate. This one was beans, yellow-eye beans, and a handful of kidney beans and some navy beans mixed in at the top. She stood over it again for a long time, and the irritation was still there, and the relief was still there, and the unnamed third thing was louder than it had been the week before. She began paying attention on the road. She watched who passed. She noted times and directions. It took her 3 weeks to confirm what she had already suspected. Noah Brooks rode past her gate every Wednesday evening on his way back from Harlow Creek, and every Wednesday evening he left something. Seeds, mainly. Sometimes a small thing, a paper of pins once, that she could not have explained as practical but that she appreciated nonetheless. Once a small tin of lard, which was practical and which she used. He never knocked. He never called out. He never did anything that required her to acknowledge him or respond or be grateful out loud. She thought about this a great deal. She thought about it while she was plowing and while she was weeding, and while she was lying awake in the farmhouse at night listening to the coyotes somewhere out to the west. She thought about what kind of man leaves things without expectation. She thought about what kind of man has gray eyes that are calm without being cold. She thought about what it would mean to ask him why he was doing it, and whether asking would change something that was, currently, working perfectly well as it was. She decided not to ask. Not yet. May came in warm and honest. The kind of May that makes a person believe in Kansas again after a winter that has tested the belief. The corn was coming up green and straight in its rows, and the milo was doing well, and the beans were climbing their stakes with an enthusiasm that Mamie found genuinely encouraging. She tended the garden every morning before the heat came, and she tended it every evening when the heat had softened. And in between she did the 100 other things a farm requires when there is only one person to do them. She repaired the south fence herself, hauling posts on Absalom's back in an arrangement that required a level of negotiation Mamie was not proud of. She had promised Absalom an extra scoop of grain at the end of the day, which was the equivalent of bribery but which worked, and she was not going to judge herself for working with what she had. She fixed the door so it closed all the way. She patched the roof over the back bedroom with a square of tin she traded for at the blacksmith's using the last of the pickled beets, which the blacksmith's wife had apparently been wanting all winter. She was at the Harlow Creek post office on a Thursday afternoon in early June when she encountered Noah Brooks for the second time in what she was beginning to think of, privately and with some amusement at herself, as their ongoing correspondence without words. He was coming out as she was going in, and they nearly walked into each other on the narrow wooden steps, and he caught her elbow without thinking about it and then immediately let go, stepping back and giving her the room she had not asked for but appreciated. "Mrs. Talbot," he said. "Mr. Brooks," she said. A pause. The street behind them was busy with the usual Thursday business, 2 wagons going opposite directions, a group of men outside the hotel, a dog sleeping in the shade of the water trough. "Your corn is coming in well," he said. "I can see it from the road." She looked at him directly. "You pass that road fairly regularly," she said. "I do," he said. He did not flinch or qualify it. "Wednesday evenings," she said. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. He held hers back without any performance about it. He was not embarrassed and he was not expectant, and both of those things were correct, and she noticed them. "The beans are doing particularly well," she said. Something genuine moved through his expression, quick and warm, and then settled back into its usual quiet. "Good," he said. "That ground on your south side looked like it would hold moisture." "It does," she said. "You know soil." "Some," he said. She thought about saying something more and decided against it. She nodded, the way a person nods when they are ending a conversation but not an interaction, and went inside to collect her mail, which was a single letter from her sister in Missouri, who wanted to know if Mamie was managing, and who suggested in delicate and well-meaning language that Mamie might consider moving east and living with them. Mamie folded the letter and put it in her pocket and did not write back for 2 weeks, and when she did, she told her sister that she was managing fine. She was managing fine. She was managing by the narrowest definition of the word, but she was managing, and every Wednesday evening there was something at her gate that made the managing a little less narrow. The summer in Caldwell County that year was long and bright and occasionally dangerous. There was a drought scare in July that had every farmer in the county watching the sky, with the kind of desperate attention that borders on prayer. Mamie watched with the rest of them, and she also dug her irrigation ditch a little deeper, and moved water from the creek that ran along the south side of her property in buckets, hauling them 2 at a time in the early morning before the heat made the effort nearly impossible. Absalom refused to help with this, and stood under the single shade tree in the yard, and looked at her with an expression she had come to interpret as philosophical disapproval. The drought scare broke in mid-July with 3 days of hard, steady rain that turned the Talbot Farms Creek into a legitimate stream, and soaked the soil to a depth that Mamie could feel when she pressed her fingers into it. She stood in her yard in the rain without a coat and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since March. That same July, there was trouble of a different kind. Cyrus Fitch, the lending man who had held Gerald's debt, came out to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon with a document and a manner that Mamie found immediately unpleasant. Fitch was a man of 50 or so, heavyset, with small eyes that did their calculating so openly that it was almost honest. He had always treated Mamie the way a certain type of man treats competent women, which is to say he spoke slowly and used short sentences, and watched her with the constant low expectation that she would not understand what he was saying. What he said on that Tuesday in July was this: that Gerald Talbot had borrowed against the land, that the debt had not been paid, that Mamie's continued presence on the property was contingent on a payment schedule that he was prepared to be generous about, and that the first payment, $40, was due in September. Mamie knew about the debt. She had known about it since before Gerald died, because she had been the one to read the documents when Gerald could not make himself look at them. She knew what she owed and when. What she did not know, and what Fitch was now telling her with his slow sentences and his small eyes, was that Gerald had signed a secondary clause, buried in the original contract in language that required careful reading, which allowed Fitch to accelerate the debt in the event of the primary borrower's death if the surviving party was not able to demonstrate sufficient agricultural income. $40 in September was not $40. It was the opening of a door that led somewhere she did not want to go. She took the document and said she would review it and gave Fitch no other information about what she intended to do, and he left, and she sat at her kitchen table for a long time with the paper in front of her, and did the arithmetic in her head the way she always did, carefully and without sentiment. If the harvest came in as she hoped, She might clear $25 if she sold some of the produce from the kitchen garden. If she could sell Absalom, which she could not, because she needed Absalom, and also because Absalom would almost certainly bite anyone who tried to buy him, and the sale would fall through on that basis alone. She needed more than she had, and she needed it before September, and she was not sure how to get it, and she was not going to ask anyone for it. That Wednesday evening, she was in the yard when she heard the familiar sound of a horse on the road, and she looked up and saw Noah Brooks coming from the direction of town, and she watched him lean down from the saddle and set something at the gate. He straightened up and she was going to look away the way she usually did, pretending she hadn't been watching, but instead she said, "Mr. Brooks." He heard her. He turned his horse toward the gate and stopped there, one hand easy on the saddle horn, looking at her across the fence. "Evening, Mrs. Talbot. Will you come in for a cup of coffee?" she said. It came out level and matter-of-fact, which was what she intended, and she watched his face for surprise and saw instead that quiet warmth again, there and then settled. "I would," he said. He tied his horse to the gate post and came through, and Absalom, who was in the yard, walked directly toward him with the fixed intention that usually preceded an attempt to bite. Noah Brooks stopped and looked at Absalom with complete calm and held out his hand, and Absalom stopped 2 feet away and lowered his head and sniffed at the hand suspiciously, and then, to Mamie's absolute astonishment, pressed his gray forehead against Noah's palm and stood there. "How did you do that?" she said. "He needed to decide for himself," Noah said. He gave Absalom a slow rub along the jaw and then walked toward the house, and Mamie held the door and they went inside. The kitchen was clean and spare and smelled like wood smoke, and whatever Mamie had been cooking at noon. She put the coffee on and they sat at opposite ends of the small table, and there was a silence that was not uncomfortable, which told Mamie something about him. She told him about Cyrus Fitch. She did not tell him because she was asking for help. She told him because she had been carrying it alone since Tuesday and something in her chest needed to put the weight down for a minute, and also because something about this man's particular brand of quiet made her feel like she could say a thing out loud without it being used against her. He listened to all of it without interrupting. He had a way of listening that was full and attentive, his gray eyes on her face, not looking around the room or fidgeting or formulating his response while she was still talking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you have the original document?" he said. "I do." "May I look at it?" She got it from the box on the shelf where she kept important papers. He read it carefully, and she watched him read it, and she noticed that he moved his lips slightly on certain passages, not because he struggled to read, but because he was repeating specific language to himself, the way a careful reader does. He read it through twice. "This clause," he said, touching a line near the bottom of the second page, "is written to say sufficient agricultural income, but it doesn't define what sufficient means. That's not unusual for Fitch. He writes contracts that favor him in ambiguous situations, but it also means you have some ground to argue on." "I know a lawyer," she said. It was not quite a question. "You know Sheriff Prout," he said. "Prout doesn't like Fitch and never has, and Prout's brother is a lawyer in Wichita." "I'm not saying that solves the problem, but it's a place to start." She looked at him. "How do you know Prout doesn't like Fitch?" "Men talk in bunkhouses," he said simply. She poured more coffee into his cup without asking, and he thanked her, and they sat with the document between them on the table, and Mamie felt the weight on her chest redistribute itself into something more manageable, not gone, but no longer crushing. "The harvest should be good," she said, "if I can get it in before mid-September." "It should be good," he agreed. "The corn is strong, the sorghum is strong, the beans are better than I expected." "You expected," she said. He looked at her over his cup. "I was paying attention." "You have been paying attention for quite a while," she said. He did not look away. "Yes," he said. She held the moment, feeling its weight and its possibility. Then she said, "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because you are worth paying attention to. It was said simply and without artifice, the way he said everything, and it hit her somewhere under the breastbone in a way that she had not been expecting and which she did not have an immediate response to. She looked down at her coffee cup and then back up at him. "I am not looking for charity," she said. "I know," he said. "I've never offered you any." This was true, she realized. What he had offered was something else, something that had no name in the vocabulary she had been using, something that was not charity and not pity and not obligation, something that operated more like tending, the way you tend a fire or a field, quietly and consistently, and without requiring acknowledgement. He stayed for an hour. They talked about the farm, practical things, the irrigation situation, the best way to handle the sorghum harvest, what the price of grain was likely to be in Harlow Creek that fall versus the better market in Wichita. He knew things and he shared them without condescension, which was rarer than it should have been. She found herself talking more freely than she had with anyone since before Gerald got sick, and the ease of it was strange and welcome in equal measure. When he left, he touched the brim of his hat and said good night, and she stood at the gate and watched him ride east toward the Hennessy place, and Absalom stood beside her and watched too, and she said to the mule, "Don't read anything into this." And Absalom said nothing, which was at least better than biting her. She went to see Sheriff Prout the next morning. Prout was a lean, weathered man of 60, who had been doing his job in Harlow Creek long enough to know where all the complicated corners were. He listened to Mamie with the courtesy of a man who takes women as seriously as anyone else, which was not universal in 1878, but which Prout managed. He wrote a letter to his brother in Wichita that same afternoon. He also told Mamie, in the matter-of-fact tone he used for everything, that Cyrus Fitch had used similar clauses against 3 other small farmers in the previous 5 years, and that 2 of those cases had ended in Fitch's favor because nobody had thought to challenge the ambiguity of the language. The 3rd case was ongoing. "You challenge it," Prout said. "You produce your harvest numbers. You make Fitch define what he means by sufficient. He won't like that." "I expect not," Mamie said. August arrived with its particular intensity. The corn was head-high and dense and golden, the kind of crop that makes a farmer feel briefly like the universe is on their side. The sorghum had done better than Mamie's most optimistic estimate. The beans had yielded nearly twice what she had planted, which was the particular magic of beans when the conditions are right. She began the harvest in the 2nd week of August, and it was clear within 2 days that she could not do it alone in the time she had. Absalom could haul, and she could cut and gather, but a 5-acre harvest is a significant undertaking for a single person, and September was real and getting closer. She did not intend to ask for help. She intended to start earlier in the mornings and work later in the evenings and simply get it done. What happened instead was that Noah Brooks arrived at her gate on a Saturday morning, a day he did not usually pass on the road, with 2 other men from the Hennessy Ranch. One was a young hand named Eli, 20 or so, quiet and hardworking. The other was an older man called Virgil who had a gray mustache and a methodical approach to any task that Mamie found immediately trustworthy. Patrick Hennessy had given them the day. Mamie stood at the gate and looked at the 3 of them and said, "I did not ask for this." Noah said, "No, you didn't." She looked at him for a moment, then she stepped back from the gate. "There's coffee on the stove," she said. "We'll start with the corn." They worked through the day with the particular rhythm of people who know how to work. Mamie directed and worked alongside them, not standing back but cutting and hauling with the same steady energy, and she noticed that Noah worked with a precision and efficiency that she had already suspected from his manner and his hands. He did not waste motion. He did not stop unless something required stopping. He and Mamie fell into a natural coordination without discussing it, working adjacent rows, their timing matching without either of them planning it. Eli and Virgil were good workers, and by the time the light was going gold and long in the late afternoon, they had the corn in and half the sorghum cut. Mamie fed them all a dinner of beans and cornbread and salt pork, and they ate at the table and on the steps outside. And the conversation was the easy, tired conversation of people who have done honest work together. And Mamie sat at the table and felt something she identified, carefully, as happiness. It was a mild happiness, practical and grounded, but it was real. After Eli and Virgil had ridden back to the ranch, Noah stayed to help Mamie move the cut sorghum into the shelter of the barn before the evening dew came. They worked side by side in the dimming light, and there was a comfortable silence between them that had been building since June, and that felt now like the silence of familiarity rather than the silence of strangers. "Hennessy let you have the day," Mamie said. "He's a fair man," Noah said. "Did you ask him or tell him?" A pause. "Asked," he said. "Did you tell him why?" Another pause, slightly longer. "I told him a neighbor needed help with a harvest." Mamie considered this. "Is that what you told yourself too?" she said. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her in the fading light, and she could see in his expression the thing that was always there in him, the steadiness and the warmth, and something else now, something that had been patient long enough that it was beginning to show its shape. "No," he said. "That's not what I told myself." She held his gaze. The barn smelled like cut grain and dry wood in summer, and the first stars were showing above the open door, and somewhere out in the yard Absalom was making his opinion known about something irrelevant. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "Noah." It was the first time she had used his first name, and they both knew it and felt it. "Mamie," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like something that had been waiting to be said that way for a long time. She did not kiss him. They did not touch. They stood in the barn with the cut sorghum between them and the stars coming out above the door, and she said, "Will you come to dinner on Sunday? A real dinner, not something I've heated between working hours." He said yes. He said it the way he said everything, simply and directly and without decorating it. He rode home in the dark, and she stood in the yard and watched the darkness on the road after he had gone, and Absalom came and stood beside her again, and this time she did not tell him not to read anything into it. Sunday dinner was roasted chicken, which required the sacrifice of one of Mamie's 3 remaining chickens, a decision she made without sentimentality, because some things are worth the cost of them. She made biscuits and gravy, and a dish of stewed tomatoes from the kitchen garden, and a dried apple pie from last fall's stores, and she set the table properly with the good plates that had been her mother's, and she changed her dress to the blue wool one that she wore to church, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and said, "Mamie Talbot, do not make something complicated out of something simple." And then she went back to the kitchen because the gravy needed attention. He arrived at 6 o'clock, which was the time she had said, and he had shaved and combed his hair and was wearing a clean shirt, and he brought her 3 early apples from the Hennessy orchard wrapped in a cloth, and she took them and said thank you and meant it. They ate and they talked, and the talking was different from all the previous conversations, which had been good but which had been conducted under the convention of something practical. This was talking for its own sake, the kind that reveals the shape of a person. She learned things, that he had grown up in Texas near the Rio Grande, that his father had been a cattle drover, and his mother had died when he was 12, and his father had done the best he could with what he had, which had been considerable in will if not in money. That he had been working cattle since he was 15 and moving between ranches since he was 22, and that the moving was not restlessness but had been, at a certain point, the only option available to him, though he did not say clearly what he meant by that, and she did not press. She learned that he had read every book he could get his hands on all his life, which was why his voice had that quality of considering things from multiple angles. She learned that he had taught himself to read from a Bible and a single copy of Robinson Crusoe. She learned that he liked the smell of rain on dry ground, and that he did not trust any man who was cruel to horses, and that he had once, at the age of 28, saved the life of a woman and her infant during a flash flood in the Texas Hill Country by swimming a swollen creek 3 times, And he told this story with absolutely no sense of his own heroism, the way people tell stories about things that required action rather than thought. She told him things too. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, the house with too many siblings and not enough room, and how she had always loved growing things, even small things, even window boxes. She told him about Gerald in the way that was true without being unkind, that he had been a man who had good intentions and limited capacities, and that she had loved him in the way you love someone whose goodness outweighs their failures, but that she had also been lonely in her marriage in ways she had never admitted to anyone. She was surprised to hear herself say it, and then she was not surprised, because there was something in Noah Brooks's particular quality of attention that made honesty feel safe. He listened to all of it, and at the end of it he said, "You have been carrying a very great deal alone for a very long time." "I don't mind carrying things," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not the same as saying you should have to." She looked at the apple pie between them on the table, then she looked at him. "Are you planning to stay in Caldwell County?" she said. "That depends," he said. "On what?" His gray eyes were warm and direct and perfectly steady. "On whether there's a reason to stay," he said. She did not answer that immediately. She cut him another piece of pie and let the silence do the work of an answer, and he understood it for what it was, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way that was not quite a smile, but that she was beginning to think of as his particular form of one. He helped her wash the dishes, which was something Gerald had never once done and which struck her as worth noting. They stood at the basin, her washing and him drying, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, and it was domestic and simple, and she was aware of every inch of the distance between them. He left before dark, propriety requiring it, and she walked him to the gate, and they stood on either side of it for a moment. He was taller than her by about 6 inches, and he was looking down at her in the evening light with that steady warmth, and she thought she might say something important, and then she thought she might not, and what she did instead was reach through the gate and put her hand briefly on his arm, just below the elbow, 2 seconds at most, and then let go. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for asking," he said. He rode away east, and she watched him go, and Absalom came and bit her on the sleeve, and she told him to stop it, and she went inside and sat at her kitchen table in the dark for a long time, feeling the place where her hand had touched his arm, and smiling in the private and careful way she allowed herself when no one could see. September came. Mamie Talbot went to Cyrus Fitch's office in Harlow Creek on a Tuesday morning with her harvest records, her production numbers, a letter from Sheriff Pruitt's brother, the lawyer in Wichita, regarding the ambiguity of the contract clause, and the sum of $27.80, which was every cent she had cleared from the harvest after expenses. She was dressed in her church dress and her good boots, and she had her hair pinned with the mother-of-pearl pins that had been the only jewelry her mother left her, and she sat across from Cyrus Fitch with her documents in front of her, and she did not smile. Fitch looked at the letter from the Wichita lawyer for a long time. He looked at the production records. He looked at Mamie. $27 is not 40, he said. Read the letter again, Mamie said. Specifically the section on page 2 where Mr. Pruitt's brother explains that your contract's definition of sufficient agricultural income, which you have never provided in writing, means that any court willing to hear the case would likely find the acceleration clause unenforceable. Which means I am entitled to continue under the original payment schedule, which calls for $15 in September and $15 in January. Fitch was quiet for a moment. He was doing his own arithmetic. She could see it. "I'll take 15, he said, finally. "It's time. And next time," she said. "And the time after that. Because those are the terms Gerald signed, and those are the terms I intend to honor. And if you prefer to have the Wichita court's opinion on whether those are also the terms you are required to accept, I am prepared to pursue that." She said it quietly and clearly and without anger, the way she had rehearsed it, and Fitch looked at her with his small, calculating eyes and saw something in her face that he apparently decided was not worth testing. He took the $15. He wrote a receipt. He gave her a look as she left that was meant to be intimidating and managed only to be sour, and she went out into the September sunlight and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment and breathed. She ran into Noah Brooks outside the post office, which had become something of a habit at this point, and the look on his face when she told him what had happened was the full version of the almost smile, wide and warm and genuinely delighted, and she thought it was the finest-looking thing she had ever seen in her life. "You walked into Fitch's office and told him to read the contract," Noah said. "I told him to read the letter," she said. "I was very polite." "I expect you were terrifying," he said. "That was the general intention," she said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, low and warm, and it changed his whole face, and Mamie Talbot made a decision in that moment that she had been building toward for weeks without quite acknowledging it. "Come to supper on Saturday," she said. "Yes," he said, and this time there was nothing careful about either of them saying it. October in Kansas is its own particular beauty, the light going amber and horizontal, the fields emptied, and the trees turning color along the creek. The air clean and cold in the mornings, with a warmth in the afternoons that feels like a gift given knowing it won't last. Mamie Talbot had always loved October, and that year she loved it with a particular intensity that she understood was not only about the season. Noah came to supper on Saturday, and then he came on the following Wednesday after his weekly ride to town. And instead of leaving the grain, which Mamie no longer needed, the harvest being in, he knocked at the door and she opened it, and they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and talked until 9 o'clock, which was late by farm standards. And when he left, she stood at the door and watched him go and did not feel the need to be measured about it. He had, at some point between August and October, stopped being someone she was carefully observing and become someone she was genuinely comfortable with, which was a rarer thing than she had previously understood. She had not been genuinely comfortable with many people in her life. Her mother had been formidable, and her father had been largely absent, and Gerald had been present in body, and remote in a way she had never been able to quite reach. Noah Brooks was present in the way she had always wanted someone to be present, attentive without being intrusive, warm without requiring her to perform anything in return. In the third week of October, he brought her a book. It was a copy of The Virginian, that hadn't been written yet. It was a copy of Middlemark, which he had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita because he had heard her mention once, in passing, that she had read the first half before Gerald's illness began and had never had the chance to return to it. He had remembered. He had ordered it. He handed it to her at the door on a Wednesday evening, and she looked at it, and then looked at him, and something in her expression must have shown what she felt because he looked slightly uncertain for the first time she had seen, and the uncertainty on him was endearing in a way that the calm never had been. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most things you say," he said. She brought him inside, and she did not wait for the coffee or the table or any of the polite conventions they had been using as scaffolding. She said, "Noah," and he said, "Mamie," and they stood in her kitchen in the October lamplight, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he covered her hand with his, and they stayed like that for a long moment, and then he bent his head and kissed her with a gentleness that was somehow more powerful for its restraint, and she kissed him back with everything she had been keeping carefully still for months. When they stepped apart, she was breathing differently, and so was he, and the lamplight was golden between them, and outside the window the first stars of the October evening were appearing. "I have been wanting to do that," he said, "since the day your mule broke into Denton Farley's store." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind she had almost forgotten she was capable of. "That mule has his uses," she said. He smiled at her. The full smile, not the almost smile, and she thought she would like to see it every day for a considerable length of time. They sat and read Middlemark together that evening. she reading and sometimes passing the book to him to read a section aloud, because she liked his voice when he read, the way he gave the language its full weight. When he finally left at 10 o'clock, which was very late by farm standards, and they both acknowledged it with the comfortable guilt of people who are not actually guilty of anything, he held both her hands at the door for a moment and said, "May I come back on Sunday?" "You may come back whenever you like," she said, and meant it in the fullest sense. November came cold and serious, with the first hard frosts that turned the creek bank silver in the mornings and made the barn smell more strongly of hay and warm animals. Mamie had taken on a small amount of work mending clothes for 2 families in town, which supplemented her savings toward January's payment to Fitch, and she was doing this work in the evenings by lamplight, which is how Noah found her when he came on Sunday evenings now, her hands busy with thread and fabric, the lamp between them, the stove putting out its reliable heat. He had begun helping with the farm in ways that were neither asked for nor declined. He fixed the fence on the north side one afternoon when she was in town, and she came home to find it done and Absalom standing beside the new posts looking, for the first time in his life, vaguely approving of something. He split firewood on a Saturday in early November and stacked it under the eave of the house where it would stay dry, and she watched him work from the kitchen window and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. One Sunday evening in mid-November, he came in and sat at the table and was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, which had the quality of contentment. This quiet had something in it that Mamie identified as decision. She put down her mending. "Tell me," she said. He looked at his hands on the table. "Patrick Hennessy has offered me a section foreman position," he said. "More pay, a small house on the property, permanent if I want it." She looked at him. "Do you want it?" "I want to be in Caldwell County," he said. He raised his eyes to hers. "I want to be near this farm, near you." She was quiet for a moment, working through it with the care she gave everything. Then she said, "A foreman's house on the Hennessy place is a fair distance from here." 3 miles, he said. "I know. That's 3 miles of Kansas winter between Wednesday evening and Saturday," she said. He nodded. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about what she was, which was a widow with 5 acres and 1 stubborn mule and a farmhouse with a repaired door, and a debt she was paying down and a kitchen table where she had been more genuinely herself in the past several months than she had been in years. She thought about what he was, which was a man who had left grain at her gate without asking for anything, a man who listened with his whole attention, a man who had kissed her with gentleness and laughed with warmth, and remembered a half-finished book she had mentioned once. "Noah," she said, "I am a practical woman. I am going to ask you something practical, and I want you to answer it practically." "All right," he said. He was very still. "If you were to stay near this farm, if you were not 3 miles away at the Hennessy place, what would that look like?" He held her gaze. "It would look like a man asking a woman to marry him," he said, "if she were willing to be asked." She let out a slow breath. She looked at the lamp and then at him. "I am 31 years old," she said. "I have been a widow for 8 months. I have a mule that bites and a debt to an unpleasant man and 5 acres of ground that require constant attention." "I know all of that," he said, "and you are asking anyway." "I am asking because of all of that," he said, "not in spite of it." She looked at him across the table in the November lamplight, this man with his gray eyes and his steady hands and his 7 months of patient attention, and she understood that what she felt for him was not the careful, managed feeling she had been naming it. It was the real thing, the complicated and whole and particular thing, and she was not going to be afraid of it. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, as though he was making sure he had heard correctly. Then he said, "Yes." "Yes," she said again, and smiled, and it was the kind of smile she had not given anyone in a very long time. He got up from the table and came around to her side, and she stood, and he took her hands and looked at her with an expression that was everything she had been watching accumulate in him for 7 months, warm and real and finally, fully said. He kissed her again, and this time there was nothing restrained about it, and it was November and cold outside, and the stove was warm, and the lamp was golden, and it was exactly right. They were married in the Harlow Creek Church in December of 1878, 3 days before Christmas, in the particular way of two people who see no reason to wait and every reason to begin. It was not a large wedding. Sheriff Prout came, and Denton Farley and his wife, and Eli and Virgil from the Hennessy Ranch, and Patrick Hennessy himself, and two women from town who had been Mamie's nearest acquaintances. The minister was a thin man named Holloway who had been conducting services in Harlow Creek for 12 years, and who pronounced them husband and wife with the satisfied air of someone who has seen enough of life to know a good match. Mamie wore her blue wool dress with the mother-of-pearl pins, and Noah wore a new shirt that he had bought in Wichita, and the result of both of these things combined in the winter light of the church was something that Denton Farley's wife described to her sister in a letter as very affecting, which was the strongest language that particular woman used for anything. After the ceremony there was cake and good feeling in Denton Farley's store, which he had closed for the afternoon for the purpose, and then Mamie and Noah drove back to the Talbot farm, which was simply the farm now, or would need a new name eventually, which they had not yet decided, in the wagon in the December cold, and she was wearing his coat over her shoulders, and the stars were very bright, and the air was very cold, and she was warmer than she had been in a very long time. Noah had spoken to Patrick Hennessy, and Hennessy, being a fair man as previously established, had arranged for Noah to work the farm with Mamie through the spring planting and into the summer while also consulting on Hennessy's eastern range 2 days a week, which provided steady income while the farm found its footing. It was the kind of arrangement that made practical sense and that Patrick Hennessy had suggested himself, which told you something about Patrick Hennessy. They settled into the farmhouse together in December. Noah moved his few possessions in. They were few because he had been moving between places for a long time and had learned to keep things portable, and he took the wardrobe corner of the bedroom and put his boots outside the door at night and learned the particular way. The stove on the right side ran hot, and the way the door in the kitchen sometimes needed a hip check to open properly. And these domestic specificities of Mamie's life became his own in the easy way that true compatibility produces. Absalom received him with what amounted, for Absalom, to enthusiasm, which is to say he only attempted to bite Noah twice in the first week, and after the second attempt Noah said, "We've had this conversation," and put his hand firmly on the mule's nose and looked at him directly, and Absalom, after a moment of profound internal debate, yielded. From that point on, Absalom allowed Noah to groom him, feed him, and occasionally lead him without incident, a grace he had never extended to anyone including Mamie, and which Mamie found both impressive and, privately, slightly annoying. The January payment to Cyrus Fitch was made on time and in full. Mamie delivered it herself, and Fitch received it with his usual unpleasant expression, and she gave him no more attention than the transaction required and walked out. Noah was waiting outside with the wagon, and they drove home through the cold January air, and she told him it was done, and he reached across and took her hand and held it for the length of the drive home. Spring planting in 1879 was a different operation entirely from spring planting the year before. 2 people and a cooperative mule, guided by Noah's knowledge of soil and rotation, and Mamie's knowledge of the specific personality of her 5 acres, could accomplish in a day what had taken Mamie 3 days alone. They planted corn and sorghum and beans again, but also a kitchen garden that was twice the size of the previous years, and a patch of sunflowers along the south fence that Mamie had wanted for years, and that Noah planted on a Saturday morning while she was in town without telling her, so that she came home to a row of small green shoots with a note beside them that said simply, "For you." She folded the note and put it in the box with the important papers. In February of 1879, Mamie confirmed what she had suspected since the new year. She was expecting a child. She told Noah on a quiet evening in the kitchen while the snow was coming down outside the window, and she told him in the matter-of-fact way she told everything, and she watched his face, and what happened to it was something she intended to keep with her forever. He was very still for a moment, and then he reached across the table and covered both her hands with his and looked at her with an expression that was too large and too complete for any particular word, and his eyes were bright in the lamplight, and he said, "Mamie," in the voice that always made her name sound like it had been waiting to be said that way. "You're pleased," she said, and it was not a question. "I am so pleased," he said, "that I don't have adequate language for it." "You read Middlemarch," she said. "You'll find the language." He laughed, and it was the full, warm laugh, and she smiled at him across the kitchen table in February with the snow coming down, and the winter was entirely warm. The pregnancy was not an easy one in the first months. She was sick in the mornings with a persistence that she found deeply inconvenient. But she was strong and she was healthy, and the farm demanded activity, which was probably good for her even if it was also exhausting. Noah took on more of the heavy work without making her feel that she was being managed or protected in ways she hadn't agreed to, which was a delicate balance, and one he navigated with his characteristic instinct for giving her room. By April, she was past the worst of the morning sickness and into the full green energy of spring, and the farm was blooming around them with the particular force of good soil and good care. The new kitchen garden was producing already early lettuces and radishes, and some peas that she ate standing at the fence, while Noah looked on with the expression of a man who knows better than to say anything about a person eating the produce directly from the vine. Cyrus Fitch made one more attempt in March of 1879. Sending a letter that implied he might have additional grounds for revisiting the debt terms on the basis of some improvement language in the original contract that he interpreted as giving him rights over any significant upgrades to the property. Mamie read the letter and gave it to Noah, who read it, and then they both went to Sheriff Prout, who sent another letter to his brother in Wichita, and the reply came back so definitively in their favor that Prout's brother included a note suggesting that if Fitch sent any further such letters, there were grounds for a harassment complaint. They sent that reply to Fitch by hand. There was no more communication from Cyrus Fitch after that, and Mamie crossed him off the list of things she gave her attention to, which was a deeply satisfying thing to cross off. Summer 1879 was everything a Kansas summer can be when it decides to cooperate. Hot and bright and generous with its rain when rain was needed, and the farm was its best self in it. Noah had in the spring quietly spoken to a neighbor family 2 miles west, the Reinhardts, who had a small place and were good people, about the possibility of a land arrangement. The Reinhardts had an unused parcel adjacent to the Talbot farm's eastern boundary, about 8 acres, that they had been unable to work because of a family illness the previous year. Noah had negotiated a lease arrangement, a share of any harvest produced from those acres, and by June they were working 13 acres instead of 5. Mamie had approved this negotiation in advance, which Noah had been careful about, because it was their farm and their future, and decisions like that were not unilateral. He had brought it to her the way he brought most things, plainly, with the relevant facts, and with a clear statement of his own view followed by a genuine openness to hers. She had thought about it for 2 days and then said yes, and they had shaken hands with the Reinhardts on a Tuesday morning, and the 8 additional acres had become part of what they were building. What they were building. She had not had those words in her vocabulary the year before, and now she used them in her own head with a naturalness that told her something about how much had changed. Their son was born on the 23rd of September, 1879, in the farmhouse in the early morning, with a midwife from town and Noah pacing the yard outside in the September dark, with such restrained anxiety that Absalom, apparently moved by sympathy, came and stood beside him for the duration of the proceedings, and did not bite him once. When the midwife came to the door and said the mother and baby were both well, Noah went inside and stood over Mamie in the bed and looked at the child, a son, red-faced and loud and already looking like he had opinions, which was the most honest possible beginning for a Talbot Brooks child. And then he looked at Mamie, and she had never seen his face like that, open and full and with nothing held back, nothing managed, everything simply present. "He's perfect," Noah said. "He looks like a boiled potato," Mamie said, which was honest, and also possibly the best thing she had ever said, because Noah laughed with his whole chest and she laughed too even though she was exhausted, and the baby opened his eyes in the lamplight and looked at both of them with the severe expression of someone who has just arrived and intends to make the most of it. They named him Gerald James Brooks, after Gerald and after Noah's father, whose name had been James. The Gerald was Mamie's idea, and Noah had agreed to it without hesitation, and she had looked at him when he agreed and known, again, and in a new way, that she had married a man of uncommon decency. Gerald James was a substantial baby who grew quickly, and who had, from the first days of his life, a personality that combined Mamie's determination with Noah's patience in alternating measure, depending largely on the hour and whether he was hungry. He was curious about everything. By the time he was 6 months old, he was already reaching for whatever was nearest with the focused attention of a person who intends to examine the world thoroughly and judge it accordingly. And Noah spent hours on the floor of the kitchen with him, letting the baby investigate his hands and the buttons of his shirt and the particular textures of things, with the same full patience and attention he brought to everything else. Mamie watched Noah with their son and felt something expand in her chest that had not been there before, a depth to her love for this man that she had not predicted, which was the expansion that happens when you see someone you already love become more than you already knew. The debt to Cyrus Fitch was paid in full by the summer of 1880, ahead of schedule, because the harvest of 1879 on 13 acres had been more than either of them had projected, and Denton Farley had connected them with a buyer in Wichita who paid better prices than the local market. Mamie went to Fitch's office on a Tuesday in July and paid the final sum and got a signed release of the debt and took it to Sheriff Prout to witness, and Prout signed it and congratulated her with the genuine warmth of a man who has watched someone fight for something and win it fair, and she walked out into the July sun feeling lighter than she had felt since the spring of 1878. She went directly to the general store and bought Absalom a bag of dried corn, which was the mule's favorite thing, and which he had absolutely earned. The years after the debt was cleared opened up like a field after a long rain, full of possibility that the weight of the previous obligation had kept compressed. They were not wealthy people. Farming in Kansas in the 1880s was not a path to wealth for small operations, but they were solvent and growing, and solvency and growth were more than most could claim. In the spring of 1881, they bought the 8 Reinhard acres outright, because the Reinhards were moving east to be near family and offered the land at a fair price that Noah had saved toward carefully over the previous year without telling Mamie he was doing it. And when he showed her the savings and the Reinhard offer, she looked at him and said, "How long have you been saving?" "Since January," he said. "Of last year." She was quiet for a moment. "You planned this for 18 months, she said. "I hoped," he said. "There's a difference." She kissed him in the yard in front of Absalom and the chickens and the open sky, and Absalom registered his opinion of this public display by walking away with pointed dignity toward the shade of the tree. They were now farming 13 acres with a farmhouse that Noah had expanded the previous summer, adding a bedroom and a proper back room for the kitchen, and a child who was walking and talking and getting into everything with relentless energy. The farm had taken on the settled, purposeful look of a place that has found its people. The fence lines were clean. The garden was abundant. The barn had a new roof. The door had not needed a hip check to open in over a year. Mamie's sister came from Missouri in the summer of 1881 and stayed for 2 weeks, and she was a warm woman who genuinely loved Mamie and who had worried about her through all of it, the hardship, the widowhood, the managing alone. She arrived expecting to find something she would need to feel sad about, and found instead a woman who was thriving in the fullest sense of that word, healthy and purposeful and clear-eyed, and in love in a way that was visible from the first moment you saw Mamie and Noah together, in the easy and undemonstrative way of two people who are genuinely home in each other's company. She pulled Mamie aside on her third evening and said, "You are happy." Mamie considered this with her usual care. "I am," she said. "Really happy," her sister said. "Not managing." "I spent enough time managing," Mamie said. "I'm done with managing." Her sister went home and wrote a letter to their brother that described Mamie as entirely herself at last, which was the highest compliment in the vocabulary of that particular family. Absalom died in the autumn of 1881, which was a grief that Mamie had not expected to feel as deeply as she did. He was old for a mule. She had never known his exact age, but he had been Gerald's before they married, and she estimated he had been at least 12 or 13 by the time Noah first met him. And he went peacefully in his stall on a cold October morning, which was better than most things in Kansas managed to go. She buried him under the shade tree where he had spent his best hours, and Noah stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. And Gerald James, who was 2 years old and did not fully understand death, laid a handful of dried corn on the grave with the solemn air of a person who is doing the right thing even if the details are unclear. They got a new mule in November, a brown animal named by Gerald James, who had definite opinions by that age, Solomon, after some complicated 2-year-old logic that no one entirely followed. Solomon was younger and considerably more cooperative than Absalom had ever been, and this initially felt like a betrayal to Mamie on a minor level. But she came around to it, and Solomon was a good working mule, and that was what mattered. Mamie became pregnant again in the winter of 1881, and this time the pregnancy was easier, and she worked nearly to term without significant difficulty, which Noah accepted with the combination of admiration and carefully concealed anxiety that had characterized his experience of the first pregnancy. Their second child, born in the summer of 1882, was a daughter, and they named her Clara Jane Brooks, for the clarity of the morning she arrived in and for no Jane in particular except that it was a name they both liked. Clara was born as her father and brother waited in the yard. Gerald James, who was almost 3, stood on a fence rail and informed the chickens about what was happening inside with the complete confidence of someone who has been told he is a big brother, and has decided this is the most important thing that has ever happened. And she came into the world with much less noise than her brother had, and with an expression of such penetrating observation that the midwife said, "This one is going to watch everything." She was right. Clara was a child who absorbed the world through her eyes, watching and considering before she spoke, which she eventually did with remarkable precision. She had Noah's calm and Mamie's directness, and the particular combination of those things was, from very early, something remarkable to witness. With 2 children and 13 acres, and a house that was now properly sized and a farm that was producing steadily, the life they had built together had taken on the full weight and texture of something real and lasting. It was not the life Mamie had imagined for herself in any specific way. She had not, in her most optimistic moments during the hard years, imagined anything as complete as this. But it was better than imagined because it was actual. It was not without difficulty. There were hard seasons and sickness and the ordinary frictions of 2 strong-willed people building a life together, which required negotiation and patience and the willingness to be wrong sometimes. Mamie was not always right, which she acknowledged, and Noah was not always right, which he acknowledged with somewhat more speed than she did, which was something she was aware of and was working on. They argued occasionally with the productive heat of two people who respect each other and still disagree, and they always came through the argument to the other side, because both of them were fundamentally committed to the thing they were building together, and that commitment was larger than any particular disagreement. In 1883, Noah took a second small consulting arrangement with a different ranch further north, which brought in additional income, but also meant several days away in the spring and fall, and Mamie found these absences sharp in a way that surprised her, given how thoroughly alone she had once been and how well she had managed it. She told him this on his first return flatly, and he looked at her with that steady, warm gaze and said, "I'm glad the absence is difficult. It should be." "That's an odd way of looking at it," she said. "It means we have something worth missing," he said. She considered this and decided he was right, which she told him, and then she told him about the 3 things that had gone wrong on the farm while he was away, and they dealt with them together, and that was how it went. Gerald James started school in Harlow Creek in the fall of 1884, riding Solomon to town and back, with a confidence that came entirely from having learned to ride at age 3 on Noah's horse under Noah's supervision. He was a bright child and a social one, bringing home friends on Fridays with the casual assumption that the farm was always open and that his parents would always produce something to feed additional children, which was not always strictly accurate but which Mamie and Noah always managed, because some things you simply find a way to manage. Clara went to school 2 years later and distinguished herself immediately as the child who asks the teacher questions that require more time to answer than the lesson plan allows, which the teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Farrow, found either delightful or exhausting depending on the day. Harlow Creek grew in those years, slowly and with the occasional setback, but growing nonetheless. More families settled. The hotel got a proper restaurant. There was talk of a rail line coming through, which would change everything for farmers in the county because it would open the Wichita and Topeka markets without requiring the long overland haul. Noah went to 3 town meetings about the rail line because he understood what it would mean, and Mamie went to 2 because she understood the same, and because she had opinions about where the line should run relative to the farm's access. Opinions that she expressed clearly and that were received with the mixed response that women's opinions received in public forums in 1885, which was sometimes well and sometimes not. The rail line came through in 1886, 3 miles south of the farm but close enough to matter enormously, and the first season with rail access their grain income was 30% higher than the previous year. And Mamie sat at the kitchen table with the account book open in front of her, and did the arithmetic and then looked up at Noah and said, "We are going to be all right." He was leaning in the kitchen doorway looking at her with that expression he had never stopped using, the full warm attention that she had first noticed across a general store in April of 1878. "We have been all right," he said. "We have been surviving," she said. "Now we are going to be all right." He came and sat beside her at the table and looked at the numbers with her, and they talked about what to do with the margin, repair the barn fully, put some in savings, buy the Reinhardt's second parcel that had recently come available further west. They decided together, as they decided everything, with the particular combination of her mathematical precision and his longer horizon, and the result was something neither of them would have arrived at separately, which was always the way. In the spring of 1887, Mamie was 39 years old and Noah was 41, and Mamie confirmed what she had suspected for 6 weeks but had not said because she was arranging her feelings about it first. She was expecting again. She told him on a Sunday morning in April while the children were out in the yard, told him in the kitchen with the spring light coming through the window, and she watched his face go through the same journey it had gone through twice before, quiet and then full and then bright. "Mamie," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you pleased?" he asked because he always asked because what she felt was always worth asking about. She looked at the kitchen around them, the cast-iron stove that she had replaced with a better one 2 years ago, the shelves with their jars and their tins, the table with its particular scratches and history, the sound of her children in the yard, and the sound of Solomon doing something out by the fence. And she looked at Noah with his gray eyes that were calmer than the Kansas sky, and she said, "I am very pleased." Their third child, another son, was born in November of 1887, and they named him James Noah Brooks, for Noah's father and for Noah. And he was from the first day of his life the most peaceful of their children, which, given the personalities of the other two, was probably what the family needed. Gerald James, who was 8 by then and had very definite opinions about being a brother, declared the baby adequate after a thorough inspection. And Clara, who was 5, sat beside him every morning for the first month and talked to him in a low, continuous, explanatory monologue that apparently communicated something. Because James Noah would look at her with his calm, dark eyes and make sounds that Clara interpreted as agreement. The farm by 1888 was 21 acres, counting the additional western parcel, and it was fully the thing it had always had the potential to be. Well managed and productive and alive, with the particular energy of a place that is genuinely loved. The house had been fully rebuilt in effect, though piece by piece, so that the original farmhouse Mamie had inherited was now the core of something considerably larger and better. On a Wednesday evening in September of 1888, exactly 10 years after the first Wednesday evening, he had ridden past and left a sack of seed grain at her gate. Noah came in from the western field where he had been checking the fence line and found Mamie in the kitchen garden, the September light low and amber on her, her hands in the dirt around the last of the season's tomatoes. He stood at the garden gate and watched her work, the way he had watched her on the road 10 years ago, and the feeling was the same as it had been then, the held breath, the rightness of the sight of her, but deepened by 10 years of everything they had become. She looked up and saw him watching and said, "Are you going to help or just observe?" "Observe," he said, "for a minute." She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the smile that she had finally, fully, let be in her face whenever he was in it. "It's been 10 years," she said, "since you started leaving things at my gate." "It has," he said. "I thought about asking you to stop," she said, "several times." "I know," he said. "I always thought you might, but you kept leaving them anyway." "You could always have told me to stop," he said. "That was always an option. I was never going to make you take anything you didn't want." She looked at him across the garden gate in the September light. "I know," she said. "That was why I kept accepting them." He opened the gate and came in, and she was still sitting back on her heels in the dirt, and he crouched down beside her so they were level, and he took her hands, dirt and all, the way he had always taken her hands. "10 years," he said. "A very good 10 years," she said. "The best 10 years," he said, and meant it the way he meant everything, entirely and without qualification. From inside the house came the sound of their children, Gerald James's voice, loud and definite, Clara's voice, precise and unimpressed, James Noah's sound, the contented babble of a nearly 1-year-old who has decided the world is interesting. The September light was the amber light of a country evening, long and warm and fading toward the gold and rose of a Kansas sunset, and somewhere out in the yard Solomon made a noise and was answered by the silence of a farm that was at peace. Mamie looked at their hands together and then at him. "When you rode past that first time," she said, "what did you see?" He thought about it with the care he always gave to real questions. "A woman who was doing everything herself," he said, "and doing it well, and who looked like she had been alone for a long time before the farm." "I had," she said. "I know," he said. "I recognized it." She looked at him. He had never said that clearly before, and she heard what was in it, his own version of the same long solitude, the years of moving between places, the father who had done his best, the work that had been a way of belonging to something when belonging to somewhere was not available. "We are not alone anymore," she said. "No," he said. We are not. The sunset came on in full color over the western horizon, the Kansas sky doing its best October-September thing, purple and gold and red along the edge of the world, and they sat in the kitchen garden in the last of the September warmth and listened to their children inside the house. And the farm was all around them, 13 years of their combined labor and love and stubbornness and patience. 21 acres and a good barn and a repaired and rebuilt house, and a mule named Solomon, who was significantly more cooperative than his predecessor, and who had nevertheless developed opinions, which was perhaps inevitable given the establishment. That winter was long and good. Noah sat with Gerald James in the evenings and helped him with his reading and his arithmetic, and Gerald James accepted the help with the impatient generosity of a child who knows the answers, but concedes that checking them is probably smart. Clara read everything she could find and asked questions that required Noah and Mamie to consult each other before answering, and Noah learned to walk in the kitchen with the focused intensity of someone who has decided that moving through the world on 2 feet is the most important project currently available to him. Mamie wrote her sister a letter in January of 1889, and it was the fullest letter she had ever written. It went on for 6 pages in her careful, precise hand, covering the farm and the children and the new rail access and the previous summer's harvest and the kitchen garden and the state of the house and the excellent and annoying intelligence of Clara and the various ways Gerald James was turning into Noah in small increments that she was not going to tell Noah about because he would be insufferable about it. And somewhere in the middle pages, between the practical and the personal, she wrote, "I never asked for any of this, and it came anyway. And I have learned that there are certain kinds of goodness in the world that do not wait to be invited, that simply arrive at your gate and do not require you to know what to do with them, and that if you are stubborn enough and honest enough and lucky enough, those things become your life." Her sister read the letter 3 times and then read it to her husband, and then wrote back to say that she was crying, which was an event of some significance from a woman who did not cry easily. Mamie read the reply and smiled and folded it and put it in the box on the shelf where she kept the important papers, where it joined the note Noah had left with the sunflowers that said simply, "For you," and the receipt for the last payment to Cyrus Fitch, and the signed release of the debt witnessed by Sheriff Prout, and the marriage certificate from the Harlow Creek Church, and the deed to the 21 acres that bore both their names. In the spring of 1889, they planted their fields together as they had planted them every spring, and the first green shoots came up in April in straight rows across the dark Kansas soil, and Mamie walked the rows in the morning light and Noah walked beside her, and between them they held the full knowledge of everything it had taken to get here. The hard years and the good years and the long middle stretch where ordinary life is built from ordinary days, and none of it was small, and all of it was theirs. Solomon stood at the fence and watched them with an expression of dignified interest. The children were somewhere behind them, Gerald James explaining something to Clara with excessive confidence, Clara refuting it with precision, Noah walking between them with the careful deliberation of a 15-month-old who has decided he is keeping up with everyone else regardless of the physics of the situation. Noah stopped walking and Mamie stopped beside him, and he looked at the field and at the sky above it and at the farm all around them, and then he looked at her. "I used to wonder," he said, "what it would feel like to be somewhere that was home. And now," she said. He looked at her, and it was the look she had been given every day for 10 years and which had never once become ordinary, and he said, "Now I know." She took his hand in the middle of the field in the April morning, and the Kansas sky was enormous and blue above them, and the soil was dark and good and ready, and the life they had made together was all around them in every direction, complete and continuing and entirely their own. The mule approved. Or at least he did not disapprove, which, from Solomon, was very nearly the same thing.